But I want to invite our panelists to come to the stage and have a seat. Okay, we're going to start with Donna Benton, Director of Planning and Community Development, the City of Dover. Donna. And Margaret Byrnes, Executive Director of the New Hampshire Municipal Association. Jen Czysz, Executive Director of the Strafford Regional Planning Commission. Anthony Poore, President and CEO of the New Hampshire Center for Justice and Equity. And Will Stewart, Executive Director for Stay, Work, Play. Let's welcome them all to the stage. Okay, so we are going to be sharing a microphone. So I'm going to give it to you for now, Margaret.
Oh, okay.
Okay, and if mine works, I can give you another one. Does it work? Can you guys hear me? Okay, so now we have two. Okay, I guess what we'd like to do, as I mentioned earlier, the success of Now What New Hampshire really depends on this being a community effort. And I think somebody mentioned, maybe it was Rob or someone else, that this can't be perceived to be a kind of infiltration of our land use boards by a sort of pro-housing community. Rather, this needs to be something that involves existing land use board members, our New Hampshire Municipal Association, our planning community, communities that organizations that represent underrepresented populations. All of us need to sort of be working together to help bring awareness to these opportunities, mentor people who are interested in them, and support them after they've found these positions. So for us, it's very critical then to have the leadership from these different organizations here to talk about what they think about this movement and maybe some of the things that they've heard and maybe some ideas that they may have for us to be successful. So we have, again, the New Hampshire Planners Association, New Hampshire Municipal Association, our regional planning commissions, the Center for Justice and Equity, and Stay, Work, Play. Very critical organizations, I think, for the success of this project. So I want to start by just asking each of you, what do you think about the project from your perspective, from your organizations? What do you think about this Now What New Hampshire? So why don't we start with you, Donna?
No, I think it's a great initiative. I think it's nice to have it all for the entire state in one location. So while one community might be really great at advertising their openings and how to get involved and seem very welcoming, maybe another community isn't. So to have this entity be able to kind of say statewide, if you want to get involved, here's how to do it. Here's who to reach out to. If you're feeling a little uncomfortable, here are some mentors. So I think it's a great opportunity. And I think you are doing a great job finding other resources and partnerships to work together and really spread the word and, you know, get more diversity on these land use boards, which are so important.
So Donna, before we move to the next person, so you're representing the New Hampshire Planners Association, and why, maybe to explain to people who don't know quite what you do, why are you particularly interested in seeing these boards have more energy and diversity from your organization?
So the New Hampshire Planners Association is made up of professional planners for the most part, as well as consultants from mostly New Hampshire, but we have some members in our neighboring states as well. And it helps because you have larger communities that might have a larger staff and more resources to be able to kind of put time and effort into these, but you also have smaller communities that might have either a regional planner setting in as their planning role and might not have as much support from your selectmen or your leadership, your rest of your staff, your own boards themselves. So it's helpful to have both this initiative, but also that network of the rest of the planners. So it's important to NHPA because in general, we want to be working with a diverse group of boards and make sure that our boards are filled and not have the quorum issues that Sarah mentioned earlier. And just in general, make sure that we're all working together to help our communities.
Great, thank you, Donna. Okay, Margaret, tell us from your perspective, the Hampshire Municipal Association, why do you guys care about this and how could it be important?
Well, for one thing, many of you may know us sort of in our capacity as advocates for cities and towns, but the other half of what NHMA does is education and training. But of course, as a membership organization, our education and training is focused on current local officials, so current individuals who serve in elected and appointed capacities. And one of the things that I like hearing about today in this room is the idea of more education and information to individuals interested in serving and breaking the barrier between having a level of interest, and actually becoming part of a land use board and serving the community. So that's extremely important. And of course, in our capacity at NHMA, we hear all the time from local officials struggling to fill positions. And we're talking municipal employment positions as well as volunteer and board positions. So there is a need, and local officials do recognize a need to get more individuals involved. I think the other reason we're interested is that a huge part of our mission is serving local government to help them effectively serve the public. And so if we want local government to effectively serve the public, what their public looks like and what the makeup is of their public, then it's going to be important to have local officials that actually represent the broadest cross-section of individuals that live in their communities. And so that's a huge piece of this as well for us.
Great. Yeah. So Margaret and I have these discussions about local control, and New Hampshire Municipal Association is very committed to the importance of local control. But I think we all agree that that's not effective if you don't have good representation on your local boards and local governance. So great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Jen, tell us from your perspective, from your vantage point, what you think about Now What New Hampshire and the plight of our land use boards and how this might be helpful.
Sure. So speaking from the regional planning perspective, first I'm going to take a step back because I know not everyone knows who the regional planning commissions are. There are 9 regional planning commissions across the state of New Hampshire, and we work with all of the municipalities in New Hampshire. We're kind of a little bit of a bridge between kind of what New Hampshire Planners Association and Donna and Margaret do and what the Office of State Planning does. I know we heard from Noah earlier and Jennifer, who's also here from the Office of State Planning. Planning and Development, I'm dating myself. Oh my goodness. So we do a lot of local technical assistance, but we also bring municipalities together to talk to one another and learn from one another. And for us, we see both the smallest communities and the largest communities, and we see the different struggles that they have to fill seats at the table. And while we're out there working with these communities, a lot of times we're helping them to work on their master plan, to, develop their vision for the community. And that's only as strong as the people that are there at the table. And so making sure that we have a complete table, a complement of board members is important, but also making sure that they're representing the voices of their community. And not just one voice. We get better planning results when we have to really roll up our sleeves and kind of dig into the issues and come to some form of compromise. And I think that's really important and requires that diversity around the table.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jen. We're going to come back to you. I want to turn to Anthony now. Anthony, from your perspective, what do you think about this movement and why it might be important? Tell us about the Center for Justice and Equity first. Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's not a commercial about the New Hampshire Center for Justice and Equity, but many people ask what we do. If I had encapsulated into 4 words, it's about power, policy, capacity, and capital, right? All in support of those who are considered usually othered, right here in New Hampshire. So those are communities of color, those who represent our LGBTQ+IA communities, as well as those with disabilities, those who are both cognitive and those that you can see physical. So that's who we are and that's what we do. And that's who we serve. We can talk about that later. But that being said, in terms of response to your question, I wrote a couple of notes here that I thought were important to say. I think as we think about the success of this effort, this initiative, I think we can talk about kind of individual kind of interventions, right? Increased education, mentorship, relationship opportunities. But I think if we're going to create sustainable, durable, institutionalized change, we need to think about systems, right? And what systems are at play here that impede a person's ability to A, be successful in this role, or I guess B, even know that there's an opportunity for them to take their shot, if you will, right? Now, in order for you to do that, I think it requires what I oftentimes talk about as 3 Ps, which are the patience, persistence, and perseverance to see this work. Now, what I'm referring to is that if we're going to do this work well, because what we're talking about is not about just processes and systems and structures and programs. We're talking about culture, right? Culture change, right? I mentioned a little bit back here, which is, why do you do what you do? Because we've always done it that way, right? That's really a discussion around culture, right? And so it's a recognition that our ROI, our return on investment, has a longer term horizon, which is why it requires the 3 Ps to be successful, right? And I think another part of this work is that if we're going to be successful in this work, we have to focus on developing relationships, because it's through those relationships that are based upon reciprocity that we can create the necessary trust that says, hey, this is a place that I should invest the one resource that I can never recover back. And as I get older, I recognize my time is so much more important to me than necessarily the cash that I have in my pocket, which is about a whole bunch of lint right now. And then I think when you think about the second part is why we as a center care about this particular issue. I think it's actually relevant even in the public discourse right now. We see it around our first in the nation debate, right? What people don't recognize is that our populations of our communities of color have grown exponentially over the past 2 years. We have doubled. We represent 13% of this state's population. And we're at a point now where we have relationships, right? We have resources and we have the necessary discretion to apply as needed, right? And so I think that it's important that we recognize that. And while we typically reside in our larger urban environments, right, with the appropriate quotes around them, Manchester and Nashua, there are those of us like myself who live in Groveton, New Hampshire. If y'all don't know where that is, it's between Lancaster and Colebrook, right? But we're all over, right? And as we talked about the intentional efforts necessary to make this successful, it's about working with that level of intentionality, who's there, and you can start with the why first. We can talk about the how later.
Great. We're going to come back to you, Anthony. Thank you. Now, Will, tell us, for those who don't know about Stay, Work, Play, and what your perspective is on this.
Sure. Excuse me. So Stay, Work, Play is a statewide nonprofit whose mission is to attract and retain more young people here in New Hampshire. And that's important for a few reasons. One, we're the second oldest state in the country by average age. We have one of the lowest unemployment rates, even pre-pandemic, and certainly that's continuing to be the case. And we have one of the highest rates of outmigration of graduating high school seniors. We're number one in the percentage of graduating high school seniors we send out of state. So we have a problem. We have our employers, as we've seen in all the headlines, are screaming for workers. And our land use boards, our Rotary clubs, our churches, everybody's screaming for people. So at Stay, Work, Play, we believe that young people need to have a seat at the table, to make the change. And here in New Hampshire, I mean, Anthony mentioned structures and processes that are almost, I don't know if they're, I certainly don't think they're maliciously designed this way, but it just kind of evolved, so that our legislature, for example, is designed to to be the oldest average legislature in the country. So I'm so glad to see people like Senator Rebecca Perkins Quokka, Representative Joe Alexander, who are able to sacrifice. They are sacrificing to be at those tables. I'm glad to see in Manchester, Bryce Cowu, Molly Lonowen, sitting on the planning board in Manchester, making those sacrifices. Molly has a kid, another one on the way. She's there, from 7 o'clock in the evening till God knows when sometime. We've talked about all these barriers, and they're real. But if we don't make it easier, and if we can't count on always having people, like Molly and Bryce on the Manchester Planning Board and all on planning boards, so we need to make them easier. We need to remove those barriers so that those voices and perspectives are at the table of renters, of young people who are facing the real life issues that a lot of our boards, the people on them, well-meaning, certainly smart people, and I'm glad they're there, but they need to be more reflective of our communities. And as we see, like historically speaking, much like the legislature, but especially I think of land use boards, it's predominantly old white guys. And don't get me wrong, I hope to be an old white guy myself one day. But we need more perspectives.
So keep the microphone for a moment, Will. So what have you heard, or maybe what have you thought about that we can do to attract more young people to things like these land use boards? Any ideas that you heard in the audience today that struck with you? Yeah.
Well, I apologize. I wasn't able to be here for the entire
Oh, that's right.
day
Yes.
today. Yeah. So forgive me if I'm, repeating anything that has been said or anything, but, one of the things I will say that, the data out there, suggests that, Gen Z, in particular, and millennials, closely behind them, really value the opportunity to give back, and they want their lives, personally and professionally, to have meaning, more so, on the broad scale than, Gen Xers and boomers ahead of them, so and oftentimes they're waiting to be asked, to join. So I think that's, part of the challenge. They're less likely to stick their hand up and, say, how about me? I mean, there are exceptions to all these rules, don't get me wrong. So one, they need to know what opportunities exist. And for land use boards, when they, I think, no offense to everyone here, I get it, I'm in this world too, but it's boring. It can be boring. Let me say it, like planning and zoning boards, people just hear the word zoning and just start going to sleep. And I've been in some of those meetings, and, yeah, I get it. You look at the agenda, you're, talking about lot sizes and things and not sexy stuff. But as we know, I don't have to tell you how super important it is, but it's not sexy and fun. There are lots of, more fun ways to spend your Thursday nights than going to these meetings. So I think kind of demystifying the process and really talking about the importance and what the impact is, really focus on impact and how young people can have an impact in these roles that might not be so readily apparent.
So I will mention a few things that came out from the discussions. One is, I don't recall who said it, but it came up a number of times, that actually, even though a lot of the work is boring, it can be meaningful. And in some cases can be sexy. That is to say, there are some great stories about what planning boards have done or zoning boards have done in terms of impacting their community. So maybe we need to share those stories because young people want to contribute meaningfully, want to do something significant with their time that makes an impact. So making that clear. And secondly, I think, as you might have mentioned, asking. And so maybe that's having existing land use board members sort of be part of this and being willing to reach out to some other people, young people in their community, say, hey, would you like to learn about this and maybe join the cause or something? So
yeah, I think, always be recruiting and, always be recruiting your replacement, certainly, but others. And, if you're an old white guy, maybe try to replace somebody who's not like you, find a replacement of somebody who's not like you. And I like the idea too about, telling stories and, using that medium to be able to share. Because I think that stories and planning and zoning don't often go together. I think they can better. I would say too, when reaching out, do it individually. It's, I used to work with Robert Turney at NeighborWorks as in a community organizing role. And in community organizers, we say an invitation to everyone is an invitation to no one. And I think that's too often what we do. Hey, tweet it out. We have, 3 open positions on our planning board. Come apply today. Okay. But if you were to ask, hey, Molly, will you join our planning board? We think you specifically would be great. And here are the reasons why. I think you're going to find a lot more success that way.
So I want to stay on this theme for just a second and ask maybe Jen and Margaret or Donna, you are aware of some of these existing planning and zoning board members who've maybe been part of this board for many years. Do you think they would be willing and open to having new people join these boards and be a part of the effort to recruit them? What is the general attitude or environment or openness to this on the part of existing land use board members? So what would we anticipate as we reach out to these boards? How would they welcome this?
It depends on the board.
Okay.
I would say there are some that are so desperate for fresh blood. They would love to have new people. They're desperate. They don't have volunteers. They struggle to make quorums. They're tired. They'd like to step off the boards themselves in some instances. And then there are boards where they've been there for a long time. They're not going anywhere. And I think we all know some of these boards, and I think I'm speaking to a friendly audience, so I can be a little bit more of a heretic in my role. But there are boards that have been there since the 80s when their planning board was formed, and they were formed to stop development. Because if we think about in the 80s, we were in the midst of a huge population boom. And there has, you know, and it's continued. And I think some of it is still perpetuated today. And I think there will be more resistance there.
Okay.
To seeing some change. But, you know, one of the fundamental roles of what a planning board does, you know, and you're talking about the, you know, let's advertise the more sexy aspects of what planning does. They're there to set the vision for the community. They're there to identify how to implement that vision for the community. And it's only as good as the people there at the table. And it's a really important role that planning boards play.
Great. Thank you for your honesty there. Margaret, do you want to add anything to that?
Turn the microphone off before I talked. I agree with so much of what Jen said. One of the things we talked about at our table was having difficult conversations, right? And so we've heard a little bit in the room about how there is definitely a difference between elected and appointed planning boards, in the sense that if you have an elected board, they run for office and they're elected by the people and they get to serve their term. I mean, that is the way the statute works. In the instance of appointed land use boards or appointed boards in general, the governing body who is in charge of the appointments, or whoever the appointing body is in your particular city or town, does have the ability to sort of set a vision for the type of group or the diverse group that they'd like to see serve on these boards. And they are not obligated to reappoint the same individual term after term. They're just not. They have the authority as the appointing authority. And so having those tough conversations, perhaps with land use board members who have been on a very long time, to talk about, like, you know, are you willing to be a mentor and work with us to bring on new folks and start looking towards the future? That's not an easy conversation to have. And anyone who works with a board probably knows that, but it's probably a really important piece of this puzzle. And I also agree with Jen that there are some people serving since the 80s because they keep not finding someone to take over for them. We see it with some of the organizations and associations we work with. There are a lot of different municipal association, like mini groups that are focused on like building officials and library trustees. And we see that over the years, the president, why are you the president again? Well, I was supposed to not be the president 2 terms ago, but then so-and-so retired and there was no one to take over. So I stayed. And then this was really supposed to be the time that I got to leave this post. And we see that a lot, that people feel obligated to stay on when they can't find new folks to fill the position. But I suppose the questions that we all need to be asking is, what are we doing to find those folks to fill the positions?
Great. Thank you. Donna, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think Jen and Margaret really hit it all, but for Margaret's last point, how do we find them? Of making sure that they feel welcome, making sure that it's not just what you see on the board, right? So if you have a zoning board of all white males over the age of 70, which some zoning boards are made up of, we in Dover, I'm the planning director in Dover too, then my other hat. So we recently had someone who wanted to hop off the board, needed to hop off the board, and kind of found his own replacement. And luckily it was another person in our community and said, I would love to be the only female on this board. Like, look at this board and this is not okay. So I think kind of announcing and talking to people of saying, hey, we want to see change. Some people are willing to get off, they don't know. And just having that conversation to say, not necessarily just because we don't have an advertised opening doesn't mean that there's an opportunity for change here or not.
Great. Thank you. This is wonderful. So I'd like to go back to Anthony now. Anthony, if you could, so one of the things that we would like to do, obviously, is bring difference of perspective and background on these boards. What do we need to do in terms of Now What New Hampshire or people involved in this to build a sense of interest and trust amongst members of underrepresented populations to serve on these boards? What are some of the key things we should be thinking about as we're launching this movement campaign?
Interesting question. So I thought, Jack, you brought this up earlier, and I had written a note to myself, like, one of the questions I was going to say is, everybody look to your right, you know, that's my other right? Look to your left, look to your right. Who do you see sitting next to you? It's somebody who reflects your lived experience. You know, as I drove in this morning, you know, my first thing I always do is look at the cars. I always look at the cars, Because cars in some way are a depiction of one socioeconomic class, right? So I saw a lot of Acuras, I saw a lot of, pretty nice cars, right? And I'm like, oh, okay. But, you look around this room, I don't see a lot of people who reflect my lived experience like Sam and I. Go Little Green, baby, right? I see you back there. And so I think, as somebody mentioned here, we need to start, if charity begins at home, and if this is the beginning of an effort, in theory, our first step should be our best step. And so we need to really think about and be reflective about who's not here today. Who is not here today that should be, right? And so I think that was the first thing that really struck me in my conversations with Sam, talking about our experience being here and going to school and where we went to school and those kinds of things. And so that was the first thing I really thought about. And as we talk about developing these relationships and ultimately the trust that's derived from these relationships that are based upon reciprocity, right? I think we need to be clear about that as well. I think what this requires is an intentional investment of time, right? I mentioned that earlier. Just because you build it does not mean that they are going to come, right? And I'm actually, given where we're at right now, looking at all these pictures around the way. By the way, I got to talk about one of these. As I sit in this room, do you think what happened in Georgia would have happened had it not been for Stacey Abrams being on the ground for the past 8 years doing what she's done? Right. So that's, for me, is a representation of sitting there, getting close to the ground, developing the relationships, ensuring that the information is accessible. Right. So it wasn't just for African Americans in that community, it was those who represent the AAPI community. It was those who represent the Spanish speaking community, whether you're Mexican, Dominican, or etc. Made these things accessible. So there are a number of different things we could do to get folks to the table in ways that they haven't traditionally been invited. But it's going to require, again, going back to what I originally talked about, is just being intentional, intersectional, and at the end of the day, authentic in our approaches. And so that's sitting down, having a conversation, talking about what we appreciate, maybe what we don't. But at least I can see this person as, somebody who has a shared, maybe not necessarily a value, but maybe an interest. The other thing I'll say is you think about solidarity movements. Because at the end of the day, we need to work across sector, which requires working in solidarity. I need to see myself in you. And if I can't see myself in you, I'm not coming. Because again, my time is valuable as a working professional, dad, a brother, a son. These things matter to me. So those are some initial thoughts I have as I thought about this work. Anyway, I'll shut up.
Point well taken. And I think it will provoke some thought and discussion on our leadership team, which, by the way, you're invited to join, as I told you, to think about those deep efforts that we need to make in the communities to build up that sense of trust and interest and reciprocity. So I think that this is going to require some thinking. It's not enough to just say, hey, come to this. So we're gonna have an event at the college and we want all you underrepresented communities to come. They're not going to come. So that's a great question. Thank you. So I want one more question for all of you, and then we want to open it up to the audience for Q&A. So I guess we heard from the tables lots of ideas about the barriers and some of the ideas or ways of attracting interest. Did anything stand out to you? So anything, say, that was a really great idea, or what, that was a bad idea. You could say that too. So Donna, we'll start with you.
So one idea that I heard that I think we have to be careful with, not necessarily that it's a bad idea, is yes, we'd love real estate agents to be involved with our land use boards, but there can be some conflict there. So I think choosing the land use board and choosing and letting them know kind of what their role is and making sure that there's some ethics. And
yeah, that was my idea. That's all right. But I will say this, we have realtors in every community, right? And they care about their communities, and they're also sensitive to the housing needs. So I do think they could have a voice. You're right. Thank you. Margaret.
One thing I heard Senator Perkins Quokka giving a plug for remote meetings legislation. Yes, I see you there. This has been legislation, as she referenced, that has been in the works for at least a couple years. I'm trying to remember if the first year was it must have been 2021 was the first year we really did a push for this. There are so many groups that we hope will see that legislation benefits them. It's so much broader than just, we want to give state and local officials the ability to meet remotely or to have more flexibility with remote access. It's about individuals who can't otherwise access governmental meetings or participate in boards being able to do so. And really, I had not even thought of it that way in the beginning, right? Because you can get pretty focused on why you're there and what you're advocating for. But as it sort of started to broaden the picture to think about folks with children, with different job schedules, people with medical issues, anything that makes it a barrier for you to be physically at a certain place at a certain time, but you otherwise have the capacity and the interest and the ability to do so. It's a huge access to government service issue that I think touches upon all of us and sort of all across the board. The other thing that I heard a couple times that I just want to speak to just a little bit was at least 2 references to Robert's Rules of Order. And I just want to touch on this a little bit. I think it's important to remind everyone that Robert's Rules of Order is not the law in any way in New Hampshire, period. And it is a body of parliamentary rules for large bodies. I mean, huge, large bodies. And so every board of every kind should have its own written rules of procedure and never say, oh, we just go with Robert's Rules of Order. Because if they're just saying that, I can almost guarantee they don't know all of Robert's Rules of Orders because the book is like this thick, right? So, and most of it doesn't even pertain to the kind of stuff we do in government in New Hampshire. So boards just need to write their own simple rules of procedure, like how do you make a motion and do you need a second, and just really simple things. And Robert's Rules is a great guide for writing rules of procedure because it has a section in it called Rules for Small Boards. And it's a very short list of things that you should consider including in your rules of procedure. So when I hear that, I can see that as a barrier to people wanting to serve on a board. They hear we follow Robert's Rules of Order and they think, oh my God, what is that? And I'll never learn that. So those are the kinds of things when we talk about talking in layman's terms or cutting down some of those sort of intimidating barriers that maybe we can all be better about when we're talking about serving on a board.
I have one more question for you, Margaret, if I could. I'd like to put you on the spot. I think Robert Turney's group came up with the suggestion about mandatory training for boards. And they said something interesting. They said, yeah, some people won't like this, but then maybe they'll step off the board and people who are interested in being trained will step on. Am I misrepresenting what Richard Table said? Yeah, I'm curious what you think about that.
My immediate reaction to it was, and it's no mystery, we've opposed mandatory training requirements on land use boards, right? So there's no mystery there. But my first thought when I heard that comment was that I'm not sure it jives with the other truth that we are so understaffed on land use boards, right? So we're desperately looking for people to serve, but we're also saying maybe this is a way to clean out boards and get us to fill up boards. So I'm not sure those two things necessarily work together. What I will say is that although we do not support mandatory training for local land use boards, as an organization, half of our mission is education for local land use boards. So we put a ton of time and energy and resources into educating local land use boards and all local officials, and we want them all to be engaged and trained. I've said this before, and I said it the last time you put me on the spot at a panel, Max, but for better or for worse, New Hampshire is a volunteer state. So there are pros to that, but there are cons as well. And if you're going to sort of hang your hat on a fundamentally volunteer legislature and local government, there are things that may just not work in that environment. And you're really relying on people to be, to be interested and come out of the woodwork and be motivated to volunteer if that's the system that you're going to have as the basis of your government system.
Thank you, Margaret.
You're welcome.
Okay, Jen, from what you heard from the different tables, anything stand out?
So this is actually a really good segue because I was going to talk about the local technical assistance piece and the need for training. So first I want to say, Margaret mentioned they're, having really good rules of procedure. There are these two really fabulous publications that from the Office of Planning and Development, the local planning board handbook and the zoning board handbook, and they have example rules of procedures right in there to start with. So as one of those entities that provides a lot of technical assistance, we're there. So if our community has a problem, they pick up the phone, they call us. If they need some help with, a planning board meeting or a difficult application and they don't have staff, they can call us. They can also call the Office of Planning and Development. We all put together our different training resources, but as we increase the need and call for training, we need to make sure that we're funding that to happen because we're calling on a demand to increase that capacity. And we need to make sure that we're putting in the dollars to be able to actually provide those resources at a quality level. Otherwise, it's ineffective.
Where should we look for the funding for that?
Legislature.
Okay.
So right now, I can tell you on the dollar side, there's $100,000 that is split amongst the 9 regional planning commissions annually to provide local technical assistance. That's $11,111 per planning commission.
Yeah, that's not a lot.
That's not a lot. We can't really do much. And I think, the folks at the Office of Planning and Development, they're probably not going to stand up and say we're understaffed, but I'd say they probably could use another person or
Do you
two.
feel you're understaffed?
So.
Okay, thank you, Jen.
Nope.
Anthony, from what you heard.
I think there's two things that I really like. And one, I think is driven by our experience with the pandemic and COVID. Was it how we had to leverage technology to ensure business continuity? And I think what we saw was had it not been for COVID, we wouldn't have sped up as quickly as we did, frankly. And so I guess there was some silver lining to what happened. And so, I think a frame I will oftentimes use in my work is we need to meet people where they're at. And that includes our professionals. And so if we can leverage technology to allow for remote meeting attendance, right? I think that's one way we could definitely increase participation by making it much more accessible. For what it's worth, there are people who are older simply don't like to drive at night, right? And and that's real, right? And so that's not a system here, but that's just an obvious thing that we need to think about. From the perspective of our lens at the center, we think about equity and we think about people's time, and people's time should be reimbursed. And I think we should really think about, there's something I wrote down today that I heard that it really hit me, which was we need to honor today by giving it our best effort. Right. And we need to honor these roles and the responsibilities that they hold by giving them the support they need and or our best effort. And part of that is recognize that their time is valuable and they should be reimbursed for it. Right? I think that really would matter. Those are two things that really jumped out at me today that I was kind of like, oh, yeah.
Great. Thank you, Anthony. And Will, you get the last word. Tell us what you heard that struck you.
The last word from somebody who wasn't here to hear the
Oh,
discussion.
that's right. That's right. All right, but anything, you get the last word.
Well, perhaps I will, maybe I'll respond to something I heard during the discussion up here. We were talking about, some of the, some towns, are just screaming, for new people and just can't find them, others less so. But I was just, the thought that went through my mind was, I'd love to see the Venn diagram of the communities that are screaming, for new blood and younger people in particular, and those that during the 80s, imposed a lot of the minimum, acre zoning and things like that effectively made it very difficult for young people who are just starting out in their careers to be able to afford to live in said towns.
Good point. And you might see some conflict there is what you're suggesting. Yeah. They'll be the same. Oh, well, that's what I meant. Yes. Thank you. All right. So we have a few minutes for those of you out here to have some questions for our panelists. And I think Sam has a microphone or he's getting one. Yeah. Okay, over here. And could you do me a favor and identify yourself before you ask your questions? It's nice for us to know who you are and where the question's coming from.
Thank you. I'm Erin George Kelly. I'm the Director of Youth and Young Adult Homeless Services at Waypoint, and I am also an alderman in the city of Manchester. So my question for all of you is, one of the things that I don't think I've heard enough in the conversation today is a little bit about how we break down what I would characterize as the culture and norm of academia and white dominant culture in boards across our state, in meaning some of the diverse young people that we might want to bring to the table don't necessarily have the kinds of clothing that all of us are in the room in their closets. They don't necessarily have access to laptops and internet. They don't necessarily have transportation to meetings. So if we're asking them to come to the table, we have to think about the culture and norms that we have set up on the boards and how we break them down in order to really make it an inviting space that they can bring their whole selves, their experience and their expertise. And I just want to second the fact that when we ask them to come to the table, they should be fairly compensated through monetary payment for their time. Because if they weren't at our table, they would be working their second, third, or fourth job to pay their bills.
Thank you. Anybody want to take a stab at answering?
All right, this is, I need to be a little vulnerable here, so please forgive me. One of my biggest kind of sometimes concerns or pushbacks is why oftentimes we in our communities of color ask for us to tell you how to change the white dominant culture that we didn't create. So I think, again, to ask those who are affected to repair a system that wasn't built for us or by us, and definitely doesn't serve us, I don't think it's a fair question. I think you and others in this room need to go back and reflect as a community and ask yourselves how you go about creating spaces that says it is safe for me to go there. So that's my response to you and anybody else who might ask me that same question. You tell me.
I'll just respond to the financial remuneration piece of it. I think it's definitely something worth pondering and considering, and I think it might become a necessity. I mean, we talked about New Hampshire kind of having that volunteer tradition, and we see it in the legislature. We see it on I think all land use boards that I'm familiar with, but that only works if you have enough people holding their hand up. And again, we're the second oldest state in the country. We're seeing some population increases, but not relative to the rest of the country. We may not have a choice. Here we can't just rely and count on that happening. And if we do, we're seeing what the results of that are going to be. So I think it's definitely something we should all consider.
Thank you. Jen, go ahead.
I want to touch on the transportation side of it. So a large role of what we do at the regional planning commissions is transportation planning. When we're planning our own meetings, we're looking at, do we have bus service available to that meeting? And, not only are we on the route, that's one thing, but is the meeting timed so that it works with the bus schedule? So that's something that if you have that service, your community board should be thinking about. Are we taking advantage of it and making sure that it's reasonable and feasible? The other thing is there are volunteer driver programs throughout the state. And that's something also that, if you're staffing a board or if you are on a board, think you should know what it is, where it is, how to connect with it. And even if it's one of your board members that needs a ride, hook them up with the volunteer driver system, give them a ride yourself. One of the things we do is we talk to our volunteers where they're at, for the meeting materials. How do you want your meeting materials? Do you want us to provide you with an iPad for use in the meeting? Do you want us to print and mail you a packet before the meeting? So we ask each individual member of our committees how they want to engage with us and make sure they have access to those materials. And as for clothes, maybe if you're in some of the cities, folks will dress in a suit, but the majority of the planning board meetings I have been to, No one is dressed like we are here on the stage. They're there in their jeans. I had the farmer who is just fresh off his truck, covered in dirt. Nobody cares. Come to the table as you are.
Great. I'm going to move on to another question, if that's okay. Jay, you had a question?
Hi, Jay Childs, JBC Communications. I have a question that's sort of maybe counterintuitive because with the work that I do, going to a bunch of meetings around the state, I've always said if you want to get involved and you don't have time to be on a board right now, it's sort of a reverse mentorship, which is that there are people on boards who have the values and beliefs of more housing, more accessibility and all of that. And keeping them on the board, retaining people, there's one or two people on those boards in communities who want the things that we want in this room. And so a great way to get involved and maybe work your way into that board is to just help. And they are looking for help. So just asking these folks, what can I do? Can I show up for a meeting? Can I help send out envelopes? Is there anything that I can do to assist? Because just as we're losing people and have open seats on boards, there are people in communities who are fighting for the things that we're talking about in this room, who also are going to step down and are also running out of time. And so pinpointing who those voices are and supporting those voices, and maybe having younger people doing that and people from other communities as a way to get onto that, eventually get onto those boards, is a great idea. So it is about recruitment. It is about filling the seats, but there are some very valuable voices in communities who need support to stay there.
Thank you for the comment, Jay. Anybody want to speak to that? Because we have another hand as well. Okay, good. I'm going to take the other question or comment. We're going to probably call it quits.
I'm Andrea Deachman. I'm from the town of Chichester. I'm the vice chair of the planning board. I have a comment, but I'd like an answer from the pros. What if we asked people to be like an affiliate instead of an alternate? An affiliate, they can talk at the board level, but they can't vote. Our alternates can't vote unless we have a space available, but that way they can come and learn a little bit about it. I'm not sure it's possible because I know we have specific rules, but just the thought, is it?
Okay. What do you guys think about that idea of an affiliate? Thank you for your question.
I'm not sure, just because the makeup of land use boards and the authority of land use boards is prescribed by statute. I'm not sure about the idea of creating an affiliate, but certainly land use boards are advised to fill all the alternate spots they have available, and alternates should come to all meetings. I remember when I was a sort of a new municipal lawyer, and I would hear these questions about, well, when are we allowed to have an alternate come to the meeting? And it's like, what? They have to come to all the meetings so that they learn. Usually alternates might come in, maybe they've never done this before, they're new. By the way, being an alternate is a great way to start on a land use board. And maybe that's something we haven't mentioned here today. It's just a great capacity to kind of come on into the board and you come to the meetings and you participate without doing the voting part, right? You're not actually sitting on the board for the purpose of that application, but you go and you learn and you watch and you absorb information. And so I hope every land use board is directing, telling, encouraging their alternates to be at every single meeting. And, I think as I think about it, it can be more of a challenge with ZBAs than planning boards in some ways, because planning boards have a statutory obligation to meet monthly, regardless of whether they have an application before them. But ZBAs don't. They meet when they have an application. And so you could join a ZBA and like 10 months later, there's an application and you've never done a ZBA thing before, right? You have no idea what's happening. Because ZBAs don't have that obligation and they often just wait for an appeal or a variance or a special exception to come before them. But I guess get your alternates participating and coming, or if even folks who are potentially interested in someday serving on the board, get them to come and sit in the audience or watch it if you're live streaming to absorb some of that information and kind of try to get ready for that.
We're gonna close with that. I want to thank the panelists for their wonderful insights and comments.